Welcome to our session panel. We're really thrilled that you were able to join us today. We have some incredible participants who will be talking about their work related to Operation PPE. My name is Jenny Sabin. I am the Weisenberger Professor of Architecture at Cornell University, where I direct the Sabin Lab, which is a transdisciplinary design research lab where I collaborate with scientists and engineers to innovate new materials and modes of making, to look at the promise of adaptive architecture, programmable materials, and the possibility of tuning and personalizing our spaces. And it was in the context of my lab that on March 24th, we launched together with collaborators at Cornell University, Operation PPE, which then grew into very rapidly a dynamic network of makers, architects, students, researchers in the New York region to deliver protective face shields to our frontline workers in New York City hospitals. And to date, we've delivered tens of thousands of these PPE products and are continuing to collaborate and innovate together. The title of our session is Operation PPE plus Informal Fabrication. How have architects responded to the challenges of COVID-19? Operation PPE and informal fabrication leverages the participatory and networked space of design and making across disciplines. Importantly, to innovate design solutions, to rapidly respond to gaps in supply chains at times of extreme crisis, such as COVID-19. This panel takes as its point of departure from the production of personal protective equipment, PPE, undertaken by individual schools of architecture and research units in response to the crisis of PPE provisions. PPE will be our point of departure and an opening to what I hope will be a discussion around larger themes addressing how our collaborative work engages issues of equity, inequality, justice, new models for design and collaboration, the democratic space of making as a collective, and more. So it's my sincere pleasure to host this panel discussion. I want to thank the organizers at DigitalFUTURES for suggesting this innovative panel, and all of those that are participating and tuning in for our session. So now I'd like to spend a little bit of time briefly introducing our panel discussants. I will start with Alvin Huang. Alvin Huang is the founder and design principal of Synthesis Design plus Architecture and an associate professor at the USC School of Architecture. He is an award-winning architect, designer, and an educator specializing in the integrated application of material performance, emergent design technologies, and digital fabrication in contemporary architectural practice. His work spans all scales, ranging from high-rise towers and mixed-use developments to temporary pavilions and bespoke furnishings. Thanks so much, Alvin, for joining us from USC and Los Angeles.
Thanks for having me.
We also have Biayna Bogosian, who is an assistant professor of architectural technology at FIU Carta. Biayna's academic and professional background extends in the fields of architecture, environmental design, computational design, data science, spatial science, and interactive media design. Biayna's interdisciplinary research has allowed her to understand innovation in design and technology within a broader environmental context and explore data-driven and citizen-centric approaches to improve the built environment. We are also joined by John Stuart, who is an innovator, designer, and registered architect, and a resident of Miami Beach, where he has served for many years on the Historic Preservation Board there. He has also served on the Board of Governors for the Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce on the Biscayne Bay Shoreline Committee for Miami-Dade County. He has been involved in numerous innovative collaborative research projects funded by the Van Allen Institute, the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Knight Foundation, and the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. Mitch McEwan, who will be joining us at the midpoint of this panel discussion. We will be in discussion until approximately 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Mitch joined the Princeton architecture faculty in fall of 2017 from the University of Michigan's Tobin College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she had been an assistant professor since 2014. She is the co-founder of Atelier Office, an architecture collaborative of studios in Detroit, Los Angeles, and Brooklyn. McEwan's design work has been awarded numerous grants, including from the Graham Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and New York State Council on the Arts. Atelier Office projects have been commissioned by the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, and the Istanbul Design Biennial. And finally, Manuel Jimenez Garcia, who is the co-founder and principal of MAD-M Design, a computational design practice based in London. His work has been exhibited worldwide in venues such as the Centre Pompidou, Canada's Design Museum, the Royal Academy of Arts, Zaha Hadid Design Gallery, Clerkenwell Design Week, and ex-Spanish Architectural Biennale. Alongside his practice, Manuel has lectured, taught, and attended juries internationally. He is currently a lecturer in architecture at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL in London. And he's also program director of their Master of Science in Architectural Computation and co-founder of UCL's Design Computation Lab. So please join me in welcoming this incredible panel of innovators, all of which who have spearheaded unique trajectories in the context of Operation PPE, and we'll be hearing from them individually in just a moment. I've had the pleasure of engaging in discussions over the last several months with Alvin and Mitch, and online with Biayna and John about our endeavors. And so I look forward to what has now been a kind of ongoing discussion that has had its ebbs and flows and hurdles. And so without further ado, what I'd like to do next is to move into our first question, just to kind of get things going. As host, I'm going to keep this organic and emergent, yet structured, and we'll let the flow of the discussion lead our way. So I'd like to first hand it to Alvin and to introduce the work that you've been doing in the space of PPE with the following question. What was the initial spark that inspired you to get involved with PPE production and Operation PPE? And how has this work importantly impacted and transformed your practice and research? And significantly, what have been the complexities? What have been the hurdles? And so I'm going to hand it to you, Alvin, to kick us off. And if you have slides that you'd like to share, please go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. Much appreciated. I do have a few slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, if that's all right.
Great.
So let me start this off by saying that I'm the Director of Graduate Post-Professional Architecture at USC. I also have a small practice, Synthesis Design and Architecture. And I've been working with digital fabrication and emerging design technologies for about, well, it's a long time now. I can't even count the number of years, but starting in probably about 2002, 2004, when I first started getting introduced to 3D printing. But the kind of initial spark for this really stemmed from actually you, Jenny, and Mitch, who's going to be coming on later. I saw a tweet from Mitch, which really made me feel quite guilty about my own lack of engagement in certain issues, particularly related towards PPE, and thinking about like how I could be using my own energies better because of the abilities that I inherently had because of the 3D printing. But then it was really the mobilization from Jenny and her movement at Cornell, and seeing the files that she had put together and put out that really kind of gave the impetus for thinking about this. But I think one of the things that I would like to really frame this on is these three quotes here, which kind of frame how I view architecture a lot to begin with, but maybe more so now relative towards this current situation, and thinking about a quote from Cedric Price, which has been one of my all-time favorites: "Technology is the answer, but what was the question?" Really thinking about how we leverage technology for particular uses. I think we have a history in architecture oftentimes of looking at technology, being absorbed by it, and then looking for technological solutions to technological questions. But in this case, how can we use the technology to answer more pressing social, cultural needs? I think another really important one here is the Benjamin Bratton quote, which kind of talks about the kind of intersection of technology and culture. And the fact that technology, I believe, is the sort of, I would argue that technology is culture, and in this case, in our current moment, and maybe best exhibited by how we're all meeting right now, technology literally is culture. Right? Like, we're able to connect because of technology. We're able to have a distributed kind of a conversation and a means of meeting one another. And in this case, my means of getting started on this path was through what I saw on social media and what I was being connected to through the internet. And then finally, the quote on the top from Florian Eidenberg, talking about architecture as a space for imagining alternatives. And I think that's really critical here, is that architecture is a space for imagining alternatives, and we can think about how we can leverage our ability to design and leverage our ability to reconsider and question as ways to rethink the way things can be or should be. So after getting the spark from Jenny and Mitch, started off our USC Architecture Operation PPE, which started off as a group of about 30, 40 students with our own private 3D printers, and then that network grew to our alumni, and then to the general public, and then quickly expanded. So we ended up in a kind of very widespread network. What you see here is an image from our first Zoom meeting, and then that network expanded. These numbers are a little bit outdated. I didn't have time to update this presentation, but we're now a little bit over 350 volunteers, 250 plus 3D printers, 15 plus academic institutions, and 50 plus architecture and engineering firms throughout Southern California. These are some of the organizations that are involved with us: schools, firms, nonprofits, etc. We are printing pseudo N95 masks and protective face shields. We're working with USC Keck Medicine, so the hospital and hospital network that USC is connected to, which I think what's important here is that what we are printing is called the backup to the backup, meaning they are not true medical grade equipment, but it is equipment that, as has been described to us, is a step above having our doctors wearing handmade masks, bandanas, and socks. Currently takes about 3.5 hours to print a single mask. $30 spool of filament produces around a dozen masks. As I said, these numbers are very outdated, so we've already exceeded our target of 6,000 masks, and we're probably around 8,000, 9,000 face shields that we've produced. Maybe one of the critical things to look at here is that last number. This was back in March when I put this together, and the 15,000 masks per day is the burn rate in the city of Los Angeles. I suspect went down for a while, and I suspect is going back to that number now again. We have, this is again outdated. We now have 8 different drop-off locations spread throughout the city, all coordinated through a Slack channel. We've been featured in a lot of news outlets and media outlets. One of the things that I think is really important for us to think about in this particular moment was thinking about this effort not just as a sort of band-aid for the moment, like thinking about how this effort could help deal with the PPE issue, but maybe also thinking about it in a strategy like the London Olympics, where it was a pandemic mode and then an Olympic mode and then a legacy mode. So in our case, a pandemic mode and a legacy mode. So we sourced 13 FlashForge Creator Max 3D printers for the School of Architecture that we could use for these efforts. But then after the pandemic, those machines will be redistributed to the School of Architecture as machines that are free to use for our students, where they can pay for their own filament and operate the machines themselves, and basically making 3D printing more equitable and accessible to our students. We tried and failed with a grant to do the same for LAUSD, where we were proposing to do 2,000 MakerBot machines for LAUSD, which would allow us to produce 13,000 masks per day. And then after the pandemic, those machines would be redistributed to LAUSD schools, along with a educational program for certification. These are some of the links in terms of our files, etc. But maybe one of the more important things, and the thing I'd like to talk about a bit more today, is this quote from Mark Wigley, where he says that architecture never derived its force from the stability of culture, but rather from the expression of those moments that stability has slipped. And I think very, very clearly we are in one of those moments right now, not just in terms of the pandemic, but also looking back on the kind of legacy of architecture and realizing that, let's say, modernism as we know it actually was a response to a pandemic as well. And so what many people don't know is that the Spanish flu had a very large part in forming modernism as we know it. And the kind of changes to a quote unquote more sterile or more austere architecture that was divorced of ornament and that was a quote unquote machine for living. And I think a lot of these ideas about modernism really came about as responses to health conditions in the early 1900s. But I think going back to what I said before about this current moment, maybe another thing we want to be thinking about is how architecture can respond to another current issue, which is the issue of equity and social justice, and what I'm calling spatial justice, and has really made me think a lot about the work I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about and struggling with in my own sort of thoughts is, particularly as an academic, like somebody who entered the academy, did really well, went into practice, and then returned to the academy to teach, is this notion that, you know, this comment might not fly for everybody, because I think generationally not everybody can remember Top Gun. But for those of you that are old enough like myself to remember Top Gun as a really kind of formative influence in your early life, it's a movie about a guy who goes to fight goes to the Top Gun Academy and is one of the best dog fighters. And after graduation, the goal of every Top Gun instructor is to be a Top Gun instructor, because if you're a Top Gun instructor, all you do is dogfight, right? And you can stay in the dogfight, and you don't have to worry about the war or the other duties that go alongside with actual service. And I think as an instructor or as an academic, there's a moment where we become quite obsessed with the dogfight or design, right? And so like the sort of what we think of maybe as the banality of practice, or even, in this case, what I'm talking about might be the banality of policy, beginning to be about the greater war as to what the dogfight is really in service of, is something that we can all be thinking about. And I think this book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, really talks about how public policy and urban planning have influenced systemic racism, and systemic racism in particular in the built environment. The middle image comes from an exhibition at the Center for Architecture in New York by Sekou Cook, where he talks about the birth of a hip hop architecture, where the formation of the projects in New York City, and that sort of thinking actually started to form this kind of alternative culture of the ghettos. And then finally, an image from myself, which is just more a tribute to my many friends and colleagues that are African American architects out there that we need more of. So with that said, thank you, and I guess that's my long-winded answer to your short question.
Thank you so much, Alvin. Amazing, and really excited to dig into the important themes that you've raised through your short presentation. So now I'd like to hand it to John Stuart to talk about the initial spark that you had in getting involved with Operation PPE, some of the hurdles you've faced, and how it's impacted your research and practice to date.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my screen, and thank you first of all for inviting me to this. It's an exciting and I think very important program for us to be looking at today. I'll set the scene a little bit. This is the lab that I kind of run on the city of Miami Beach as part of FIU, which is in Miami. And it's about 60 3D printers. We're the kind of lab where you're encouraged as a freshman to come in. If you have no idea how to 3D print, we take you in and say, okay, here's a printer, try it out. And if you mess it up, then you go to YouTube and find out how to fix it. And then if you really mess that up too, we'll help you and we'll make sure the printer's working and all that. But the idea is that it's a kind of very hands-on experiential lab called the Carta Innovation Lab. And in 2020, this is kind of what it looks like. That changed almost immediately. Let me just go down here. And I should say, you know, obviously in the pandemic, but before I get to that, I wanted to mention that also in January 2020, we were looking at the lab as an opportunity to be part of a community, and I'd officially joined this community called Tikkun Olam Makers, the TOM makers, and it's a community of makers that's focused around Tel Aviv and New York with members around the world. And we had a conversation on March 17th about what was happening around the world. It was a conversation with colleagues in Medellin, in Tokyo, in Melbourne, in London, and we were all wondering kind of how we were going to approach this pandemic. And I should say that the Tikkun Olam makers, Tikkun Olam is Hebrew for repair the world, and the idea is that this is an organization, and our focus in this organization is to provide 3D printed products for the elderly, the poor, the disabled, who otherwise can't find things or can't afford things that are available through commercial means. So we were really interested in how the value of the 3D printing can really kind of be drawn out of the by this customized approach for those in need. So we quickly realized that we had to kind of fill in this, where industry was not, as Alvin mentioned, you know, industry was not kind of fulfilling its promise in March. And we decided first thing to distribute the lab, and we recommended that other labs around the world do the same thing, because ours, as you saw, was all in one place, but we needed them to be, in order to be nimble, we needed the equipment to go out to other people. So we had faculty and students and staff members who were willing to take printers home at the last day that we were allowed in the lab to do so. And that enabled us to, and I would have to say that staff members in particular stepped up in the very beginning of this. And that enabled us to kind of get in the very first week in March when we were working on this, to start looking at what was out there. And I should also say that FIU was fortunate to be headed by President Rosenberg, who immediately saw the need and saw our potential and focused a medical team on the lab and put us in touch with doctors and nurses who would be able to kind of manage our design as we were making prototypes and figuring things out. So the stethoscope was something we tried and we tried out, but it had too many pieces. The valve splitter was another thing, but valve splitters were really, at that point, people were pretty sure we were going to use valve splitters, but they weren't yet. But our hospital, we had a hospital partner from the very beginning, starting in March 18th. We were working with Baptist South Florida, one of the largest health providers here. And they weren't interested in using splitters if they could help it. We also tested the nasal swab, but learned that we really didn't have the capacity to print those on our MakerBots because it required a certain type of resin. And we landed on a face shield a face shield design that we had received from an open source face shield design that we received from our Tikkun Olam partners, that we then started to modify. We also were thinking that whatever we modified and whatever we made had to be replicable, particularly in Latin America. We predicted that this was going to be an issue, and we had number of connections to the lab to Latin America. So almost as soon as we started printing these face shields and putting up online our modifications, schools around Latin America were printing them as well. And taking the idea. So this kind of brought me back to my school days. I started at Columbia when Bernard Tschumi. I went to study with Bernard Tschumi and started with his first year. And then out of school, I worked for Zaha Hadid and Gaetano Pesce. And it brought me back to the days when we were really thinking about architecture and space and design as being kind of fluidly in a variety of contexts at one time. So you'd be working in Gaetano Pesce's office, for example, on a city plan, and then an umbrella stand, and they would both be kind of like feeding off of each other, and you'd be thinking about the interconnectivity of the two. So we had to switch. What we did was we brought the dispersed lab back to a central location again, and we became in part. So we brought the lab back to the central location, but then we added pieces, much like Alvin was talking about, but not to the extent, but we added individuals to our cluster. And this is just some examples of the things that we had to do that were just unexpected, like just figuring out, I hadn't really been a person who was like figuring out production. I run an innovation lab. Nobody's allowed in our lab to print something that they already know what it looks like. So this was like, and suddenly we're printing the same thing. And the only thing we're looking at is how many can we get to the hospital by what date and when will they get them? We also had to kind of print the instructions. How do you use this? We had architecture students working on the instructions on how to help a nurse or somebody, provider put it together. This became a series of production, and these are just images of, you guys have probably all seen these, but just of creating the mass, of switching the lab over. This is an old number, but we have 6,500, probably with 7,500. By the end of next week. We're still very much in production. I'd actually never even put these images together. So this is the first time just kind of throwing things together. But one of the interesting things that I think gets to Jenny's earlier question was who the communities were that we served. So on the lower left, you can see we served West Kendall Baptist Health. They were our first. We got them 1,000 within a week or some 1,000 face shields. But we also serve first responders. So we had Miami-Dade County firefighters, Miami firefighters. We still are, we were working with, on the upper left-hand corner, that's a local Baptist church to provide minority-owned business owners with minority-owned businesses with PPE. And so that we had a trustee of the university connected us to the church, which then distributed the face shields, particularly to hair salons and barbers. And then we continue to work with FIU Embrace, which is supporting which provides people with special needs on the autistic spectrum, the elderly, from around the state of Florida with the PPE that they need. And they're still, it's a group of smaller organizations. So at FIU, the FIU Embrace kind of helps us to distribute, to get the work out to them. While we were in this process, we received grants to buy more 3D printers. We have probably about 150 3D printers now working on the project. We've now been working on a couple of other things. These are some experiments that were along the way. One was on the upper left. You can see a way to kind of create the mask that's not so, it holds the mask elastic. The lower left is an open source door opener, a handless door opener, and on the lower right was a version of that for those who don't have dexterity in their fingers, or who have more strength in their arm than they do in their hands to open doors. And those are being tested now in the nursing and medical community. So these are a little embarrassing, but what's a pandemic without some humor? So these were, we knew right away that we needed to get shields that were face masks at the same time. We didn't exactly know how to do it, and just one day I grabbed a garbage bag. So we had been working on it a little bit. The upper left is with the green screen is the very first one. Then the president said, we need these mask shields, these shield masks for court. That this is the Miami-Dade County courts they're not able to use face masks in court because you need to be able to identify people who are in the courtroom. So I just ripped up a garbage bag and put it on my head and with the face shield. And the idea is we were looking for something that was modular. And so we started bringing sewing machines. This is completely new to us. And we've now engaged a sewing lab at FIU in the art department. And we're working on this to create something that could be a swap out. So you may have the shield, but you need the shield to be a mask. And so you just change out the shield, and this lower one on the bottom is that. We're still working on this. It's very much a work in progress. I think Biayna is going to talk about the NSF Rapid Grant. So I'll let her mention that, but I was fortunate enough to be invited to that. And then we're also working on the Department of Transportation's Inclusive Design Challenge for automated vehicles. And we think a lot of what we've been doing here has helped us to prepare for that challenge, which is a design challenge to think about what will be needed for those with disabilities, any disability, to safely and effectively ride in automated and self-driving vehicles. And so what's next? The university has implemented a new FIU work group for 3D printing just-in-time solutions. This is now, it's kind of centered in architecture and expands to nursing, medicine, and public health. These were connections that did not exist at all in the past. And the idea is that this pandemic is just opening up the potential within the university. And it's interesting how university structures simply don't know kind of what they have. And it's important to be able to kind of bring those together. And another is that we've started in the process of creating an MOU with the Children's Hospital to explore customized 3D printing for children in healthcare settings. So think about how a toy can become therapeutic, a mask can become something that's a toy something that can be more playful to the interest of the child. These we have not before had a hospital particularly relating to children that was interested in working with us on that. So so I think that there are many, many new opportunities, and I was happy and honored to be able to share some of them with you.
Thank you so much, John. Incredible work, and congratulations on receiving one of the rapid grants with Biayna. That's wonderful. So now we will hand it over to Biayna to pick up on some of these themes and collaborations that you both have ongoing, as well as your own individual work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity and for the conversations that we've been having and we will continue to having on this panel. I will share my screen. And talk a little bit about the timeline of our efforts. And I'm also part of Florida International University and kind of efforts that were happening in parallel with what John and the EMBA studio were doing. So about 2 years ago, National Science Foundation put out a call to think about future of AI and automation. So the CXL program, which was a quite ambitious Shark Tank style, quite unusual call, allowed different universities to partner with industries and start to completely rethink maybe an idea of an academic research and in context of also production, automation, and workforce training. So as part of that, since we were part of School of Architecture, we proposed the Robotics Academy, and with that, creating a platform that would be cloud-based, AI-powered, and it would have a series of components that would allow us to, after a series of interviews with industry experts and understanding needs and hopes of the industry, start to think about these different components. So we were right deep into developing this platform, which allowed us to then partner with a lot of different companies like Microsoft and Unity and ABB. And we were very much kind of immersed in this world of platform development and really thinking about connecting different expertise, different resources when obviously COVID happened. And although we were on a very, very tight deadline, we completely dropped everything, and our Slack channels completely were taken over by the efforts that were happening in Cornell, USC, but also under industries. And we were observing that, and while, let's say, our own EMBA studio was trying to mitigate production, was trying to think about how DIY methods and tools and workflows could potentially respond to the crisis that was the unknown crisis that we're still dealing with. But ultimately, what was really necessary in this case, which is what you guys did in different capacities, was to really rethink this idea of DIY, fabrication, and in terms of data collection, fabrication, and production, and really perhaps think about a DIWO or do it with others model. With that said, we completely started to think about how our platform could be then adapted for other uses. So NSF had a call out in March 25th. What was really interesting about this rapid call, and rapid calls are often put out to address a very specific issue. You do not have much time to apply for this, and these are often awarded or sent to people that already do have grants. So in a sense, it allows you to bypass a lot of bureaucracy, and already kind of you have maybe more opportunity or a chance to get this grant. But it was also quite troubling to think about that the only way that you could apply for a grant like this, that you could begin to do research of this sort, you already need to be part of kind of a chosen maybe group that already has certain certain facilities. So this was an interesting internal conversation amongst us. So how can we start to think about the platform that we already have, and start to think about the efforts that were happening and ultimately facilitate that. So our proposal, which has been funded since, is a platform for mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on healthcare systems. And one thing that we observed while looking at what Embos and John's team was doing was actually inefficiency of how maybe sometimes us as designer are applying when designing to these things. Do we really need to spend this many hours 3D printing this, then when maybe there could be some alternative methods of production. But how do you know this information? How do you know where to go and find, let's say, filament? How do you know actually what hospital or resources need what? And I've heard a few of the talks that Jenny and Alvin and Mitch had in this regard, and talking about how actually finding and kind of delegating these resources was a very big component of this challenge. So another thing that we were interested to explore was to start to think about other modes of engagement. So after talking to healthcare providers in Miami, we realized that actually some of the issues is not just providing the PPE, but also the training it takes to use them. So as part of what we're developing is an augmented reality mobile application that allows you to step-by-step understand the product that you have in hand and how you'll be able to use it. And although there's been a few other efforts of thinking about how, let's say, immersive media like AR and VR could start to facilitate training, our recent conversations with the healthcare providers have been actually, have started to influence our thinking. Actually, some of these, let's say, ventilators or very unique equipment, they require a lot of, let's say, focused training. So what right now some of the healthcare providers are telling us is, what if we actually start to rethink our training platform for not only supplementing some of the help that they're going to be needing, but also start to think about public awareness and kind of the public education as a component of this platform that we're creating. So I want to kind of talk about this also in the context of funding and importance of support for research, importance of support for production. We are in a very fortunate position to be working in institutions that can allow us to take advantage of facilities that they have, resources that they have for us to do these productions and assistance. But as I mentioned, the issue of even applying for these fundings when you already need to be part of a certain group, I think that's quite problematic. So going forward, I think it's quite important to think about how funding and production could be done in a combination of perhaps in research and academic institute, but other alternative modes. And this is something that I'll be curious to hear Alvin's point of view, because I know that you have been working with City of LA to think about, let's say, funding for supporting the efforts that you're doing. So I'll be curious to put this forward as something that we discuss, kind of combination of institutional based and also independent and free. And this has been also part of the conversations that we've been having behind the scenes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biayna. Amazing, amazing work. I look forward to taking a deeper dive into it and exploring how both your funding and also your relationships with collaborators are continuing to open new trajectories. So now I'd like to pass it to Manuel to talk about the initial spark that got you involved and inspired to begin producing PPE, but also importantly, how that's impacted your ongoing research and practice work.
Perfect. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good on my end.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in a panel that I think for me is incredibly important, not only for addressing this crisis, but to see how we can accelerate progression at so many other levels after this crisis is finished, and it will be finished. Right? So as a brief introduction, in addition to how Jenny already described, I also run a robotic manufacturing company based in Spain called Nagami. an automation design agency based in London as well, with my colleagues from the Design Computation Lab at the School of Architecture at the Bartlett. And all of these kind of different hats that I daily alternate between are kind of focusing on the same issue, which is mainly how we can start to make use of automation for architecture and for other domains, increasing not only productivity, but also increasing the social component that I think automation could help us develop further in the domain of design. So kind of in short, summarizing the moment where we're at right now, everyone is calling this Industry 4.0. And it's really kind of a reformulation of a model that was incredibly necessary at one point and incredibly creative as well. That was the creation of the assembly line by Henry Ford. And this allowed to get people access to the automobile. The automobile already existed, but the modes of production that Henry Ford established managed to get the production costs down and the efficiency level much higher. And that's a model that we are still using today, and it implies centralization, right? Which kind of it has been, or the problems of centralization has been very widely revealed during the crisis. One of those being the production of PPE, or the vast majority of it centralized in Asia, who suffered the consequences of the virus prior to its outbreak worldwide. Therefore, they were in a sort of production, and demand was exponentially increasing. So just to summarize some of the aspects of a centralized assembly line, it's a very long and wasteful production chain, right? And it requires a high investment. You need to set up this series of machines and molds and kind of re-establish methods that are connected linearly to generate a single product. The obvious advantage of that is that you can mass produce that product much more economically. On the other hand, 3D printing and more widely digital manufacturing technologies aim to establish an incredibly short production chain. One machine, infinite number of products, right? Which basically leads to an on-demand production without holding stock, right? So that means that we can massively reduce the waste, and not only from the production point of view, but also from the material point of view, right? Especially, obviously, with additive manufacturing. And this opens the door for products to start to be unique or to be slightly differentiated, right? So we a few years ago, it was really a spin-off of some of the research that we were doing in Design Computation Lab at the BPRO in the Bartlett School of Architecture. And it had as a main aim, not only to allow us to produce this kind of very innovative objects that we were investigating in the lab, but actually to increase efficiency in large-scale 3D printing to the point that 3D printing could be, at that scale, commercially available. So the main objective was, let's say, not to do pieces for the museum, like the one that we started with, that you're seeing in the screen, but actually to start optimizing our production towards getting 3D printing real products of large scales to the wide masses, right? So we launched the company in 2018 with a series of projects in collaboration with other designers such as Ross Lovegrove, Zaha Hadid Architects, Daniel Widrick, to kind of experiment with our technology to find the balance in between this efficiency. So there were real products that we will go to real people and real shops, right? But to investigate one aspect of 3D printing further and see how to push that technology to create something that was not possible before. However, one of the main advantages of large-scale 3D printing or robotic plastic extrusion in a more technical name is speed, right? So we are compromising in surface finish by acknowledging the toolpath that we follow to deposit our material, but in a change we're massively increasing printing speed. So we kind of knew before, like responding to the initial spark, we knew that digital manufacturing technologies and 3D printing could play an incredibly important role in the crisis before the outbreak in Spain. That kind of unfortunately happened quite early. And we kept already our eyes very open, knowing that we could jump to a complete new product incredibly fast, and we can produce immediately, and we could also produce much faster than a commercial desktop 3D printing machine. So when the conversation started to turn around PPE, and it happened obviously not only in Spain, but also worldwide, we saw that that was a product that was kind of incredibly easy to jump into, and that could admit our fabrication methods. And just with a very slight reformulation, we can adapt to print in our robots in a serialized manner, which would mean with the 4 robots that we have, and we kind of jump immediately, or we change our entire production towards PPE, we could make 1 face seal every minute. And it's incredibly important. We became part of a larger platform in our hometown, and then extending to the entire country, but mainly obviously focusing on Spain that was very hit by the virus. And we started organizing ourselves to collect other people's prints, to deliver ourselves to the local hospitals. Yeah, well, you can see here the efficiency, but mainly making a very direct use of one of the main advantages of 3D printing that we've been talking about and outlining for many years, which is obviously distributed manufacturing, right? This is an article from 6 years ago, where we already had more than 750 million people with access to a 3D printer within 10 miles, right? Obviously, that number has dramatically changed, and especially lately. And this means not only that we can reduce CO2 emissions and long-range shipping, but that we can immediately jump to participate in solving a wider cause that requires a specific product that we were not prepared for, right? With our current manufacturing systems, especially with centralized manufacturing. So we were incredibly happy to see the entire maker community reacting to this issue, and obviously some of the people in this panel are in this collection as well. But this collection could be extended in numerous slides, and I think that has been a beautiful project. But also, it has acknowledged some of the power of the technology and a new mode of the design thinking, together with its advantages in terms of decentralization. So one of the main issues that we had when we were producing, and at first we relied on established governmental platforms, and then we actually realized of the inefficiency of that system in certain cases. So we went for a full distributed network. And we were just doing that between ourselves, just contacting each other in WhatsApp groups and talking to hospitals to see what's needed and when. But we very soon started to work in the other company, Automated Architecture in London, together with Calvion, for a mobile platform that could actually automate that connection. So this platform that is we have recently launched in beta is basically aiming to connect material providers with 3D printer holders, right, makers, fabricators, with those who need those products, and you can specify when, how to intervene, giving facilities to transport. So it is a global network that can be used not only for this specific case, but I think empowers this technology and this way of distributing design and making to satisfy other needs that will certainly emerge, and that did emerge and probably will start acknowledging after COVID is gone. So we start kind of also envision what will happen, or what is the potential of these distributed digital manufacturing technologies, and not only at the scale of products, but also at the scale of architecture. So a parallel development that we have very certain in the establishment of the company a few years ago is to increase the scale to produce larger, faster, and more reliably. So we've been working on larger scale products and pieces that start to hint the potential of 3D printing in an architectural scale, like this sculpture designed by Ross Lovegrove, which is 3.5 meter tall, and is printed in a single shot of 48 hours. So this starts to kind of open up a discussion on if we can distributely produce architectural pieces, and we can do that locally, right? Would that change the way we start thinking about assembling a building, right? So I mean, that's an open discussion to kind of put on the table, as well as let's say something that kind of the crisis uncovered, and that I think is full of potential for our discipline. So yeah, with that, thank you so much, and I guess we will now initiate a larger conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you, Alvin, John, Biayna, for sharing your amazing work. It's really fantastic to see, the extents of what started with PPE and how that is now leading into new projects. And I'd like to pick up from there in terms of, talking about what you're working on now, and how you are, as architects, continuing to respond to COVID-19. And, obviously COVID-19 is a health problem, but in many ways it is equally a design problem that has uncovered and exposed extensive areas of inequality. And I think all of us on the panel today come from, years of experience working with emerging technologies, working with digital fabrication platforms. And I know for myself, there have been times, especially, in the sort of mid 2000s on, where I grew a bit frustrated by our own community, and that we were so fascinated by the tools. And in many ways, maybe that was necessary. We needed a good 15 years to figure out what we were doing and what is possible. But one of the things that I have been, really inspired by and have thought a lot about is that the early pioneers of mass customization and digital fabrication, and I think about people like Bernard Cash and others, they were really interested in the democratic and informal space that digital fabrication could afford, and bringing design to a diverse set of communities and audiences. And I think we saw a kind of breakdown of some of those early trajectories, which again, maybe that was necessary to get to where we are now. But in the context of Operation PPE, the power of the network, you know, and looking at, and Alvin, to use your words, how technology has not only served as a bridge, but it has allowed us to connect. You know, that as you say, technology is culture, and it's, I think, opened up a whole series of questions where we're forming new modes of practice and new models, but also beginning to address, you know, a critical agenda, you know, and you know, Alvin, you talked about the importance of spatial justice, you know, considering Biayna, how we move from, you know, DIY to DIWO, do it with others. I love that. You know, what are the communication platforms that we need to innovate around, you know, to push this forward? So I'd really love to pick up on some of these themes as they are impacting your current work, but specifically, you know, what are the new models that you're seeing that are in formation for practice and collaboration, and how might they begin to open up a continued critical, responsible set of trajectories that address these inequalities that have been so massively exposed, that have been there for very, very, very long. But we're seeing them sort of front and center. And I think, you know, the work that all of you are doing is amazing. So I'd like to pick up on some of those topics. And if any of you want to jump in, feel free, or I'll maybe call on one of you to kick it off.
I mean, I think a big point that you touched on there is, you know, let's say the role of Bernard Cash in the open source movement, and how that sort of ethos, because it really was an ideology, not just a technique that Bernard was speaking of. And I think, you know, that's something that I think has really come into play with the way, like, let's say, both the response to the pandemic and Operation PPE has evolved, but as well the sort of response to design as protest, and beginning to think about like the kind of movements that are happening in response to racial injustices have happened as these kind of grassroots distributed networks, non-centralized, not at all about singular authorship, all about kind of collective energy and collective movement, have really been enabled. And let's say in a way that, you know, I think reflects back on another book from that same era that has been really influential on me, which was Kevin Kelly's 10 Rules for the New Economy, you know, where he talks about a kind of networked society and a networked economy, where it was, I think the other book was The Hive Mind by Kevin Kelly, you know, where he talks about like distributed intelligence rather than, you know, individual intelligence. And I think now we're seeing this kind of moment that there is power in numbers, and that the distribution of that power and the distribution of, let's say, kind of, you know, I mean, it's fascinating to me that now I rely on Twitter more for news than I do news. You know, like the other day, literally just something as stupid as I went on a hike with my family, and I wasn't sure what the conditions of that hike were going to be, if there's going to be too many people or not. And I checked Twitter and Instagram to see who was posting about being there. And some people were saying, oh, there's a lot of people here without masks. So I decided to go to a different place. You know, and we're kind of experiencing this kind of real-time feedback through the network, but also finding ways that real-time feedback isn't just about kind of immediate response, but can also be about a kind of strategic collective response.
Yeah, if I can contribute to that as well, yes, I mean, I think the evolution of architecture and design in the last, let's say, 20 years with the emergence of new technologies has been also as as in many other examples, right, it has multiple stages. One is the promise, right? So the original promise was a distributed network. Then is the early adoption. In this early adoption, kind of comes together with an over fascination for the tool, and sometimes you actually even kind of forget the main premise or the main purpose. And when these tools started to become available, and architecture studios, universities started to be transformed with the introduction of 3D printing and CNC and so on, we realized that we could do forms that we couldn't before, and we kind of stick to that for quite a while, right? And the entire discourse of digital technologies was extremely linked to parametricism and other kind of ventures in digital design. And I think slowly when we start to understand these technologies better, we see beyond the initial application and see what they are capable of. And sometimes we need an event like the one we've just gone through to uncover its real potential. And I think I'm incredibly happy to see how lately in this last 4 months, and no one is actually talking about what you can do with these technologies in terms of in terms of form, but actually in terms of taking advantage of decentralization, of network. And I think we start to grasp, and I've been in several conversations around this topic, we start to grasp the real dissolution of a previously assimilated model of the architect, right? We are the generation that comes as right after the Starchitect generation, right? And we still believe that through these technologies we could just do better. We could be better than them because we can do more crazy buildings, more crazy architecture. And now we start to really realize that we can do something much more. But that implies really do the giant step of start thinking about us as architects, as technologies, as designers, as a network that has a power that was unprecedented. And I think the projects that will come after COVID-19, even if they will not have a real proximity to solving the crisis, will be of incredible relevance for the profession and for the new development of that technology with it.
Have we talked about the public imaginary yet? I know I'm joining late.
No, welcome, Mitch. We're really happy to have you here. Yeah, no, go for it. And then we'd love to give you some time and space to talk specifically about your work and what you've developed in the context of PPE, who you've been collaborating with. And if you have slides you want to share, absolutely feel free, but go ahead and kick it off.
Okay, yeah, no, I wanted to kind of jump just into the middle of this conversation, but to highlight the public imaginary, because I have a different take, I think, on kind of what makes this significant, this moment for architects. I don't think it's so much about our power. I think it's about the public being empowered to imagine. And if you think about what's been holding us back as a field for more than a generation now, I think for multiple generations, including these amazing technologists. I mean, going all the way back to Buckminster Fuller, right? I mean, trying to rethink the 30-year mortgage along with all these other systems. It's really the public imagination. And if we're only really kind of in dialogue deeply with urban planners, other architects, and real estate developers, then game over. It doesn't really matter what we're imagining if those are our only kind of real co-conspirators in the game of imagination. And so I think one of the things that this pandemic has done is opened up for everyday people. There's kind of a very stark, it's unfortunate, the situation that the mask itself is so politicized. But I think part of what that simple device reveals is that there's a very stark difference between the kind of Margaret Thatcher rejection of society, right? Margaret Thatcher says society doesn't exist, right? It doesn't matter if I wear a mask or not because I am just not in the world, versus what I think is a much now more visceral reality of the social. And so, yeah, you do have, Black Lives Matter is not new, right? But what's different is that there is now a multiracial coalition, and especially white folks in very majority white states and majority white towns who are also participating in this becoming a 50 state, kind of moment. I think that is also directly related to the experience of the pandemic, that society, whether we live or die is something that we decide together, that we imagine together, and that we participate in together. So I think for us, I think our discipline is in a very charged place in relationship to that, because we do have all these techniques. But now it's time, I think, also to be in dialogue with other imaginaries with these techniques, which is something that I think technology does not always help us do, because technology is usually putting people in the position of a user, and a user with a product. And I do not think that is what gets, these white guys in LA to go cuss out the police commissioner, is not because they felt like they were a user of Zoom. It's because they felt empowered to be citizens who also said Black Lives Matter. So that is something that I think our discipline may need to actually have a pushback on with technology, how we participate in setting up a way for people to be in dialogue with each other beyond just kind of nodes in a network even.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, do you mind talking maybe, or just sharing a little bit specifically about, some of the things that you're spearheading now in the context of public imagination? And
yeah,
that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So I think why I got into this this kind of kernel of folks talking about PPE is because I reached out to Jenny, Sabin, and Alvin, and I were in dialogue, I think back in March, to figure out how we could kind of build off each other's experiences in converting architecture capacity into PPE capacity. And so at Princeton, I led an initiative to reopen the School of Architecture labs, specifically to use the Zund and the 3D printers. The Zund is as a Swiss blade, a CNC Swiss blade. There aren't that many of them in the country. So we ended up using different models of face shields that were particular to what we could do with flat sheet. And working with, and it's a different situation because it's central New Jersey, it's a small town with pretty well-resourced hospitals, but even they had some issues. And now what's happening is, after we made 2,000 face shields, and we didn't deliver them ourselves, we tapped into this other network. Now that the US is bizarrely, as Rachel Maddow calls it, going into peak plateau, right? What I've started to do is go back to that network and say, okay, if hospitals are not really coming to us for PPE, how do we pivot this into something that is for the retail workers, for the delivery folks, for everyone who's on a different kind of front line? And how do we even think about that work? How do we think about, because we still have just a small inventory of the stuff that didn't go to hospitals. How do we use that inventory to test out a different relationship to a wider public beyond healthcare? That's what we're doing now, at the same time that I'm doing my sort of regular experimental architecture work and the practice that I just merged with Amina Blacksher Atelier Office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. Congratulations, by the way. I saw your big launch. It's really, really exciting. It's awesome. So maybe I'll shift to Biayna, because I would love, and this I think relates to what you brought up, Mitch, around public imagination and what has been there but has been sort of, I guess, sort of seen in new light. To talk a bit more about what you're doing in the context of DIWO and how that might connect to your recent funding with the NSF, which is super exciting, and your collaboration with John.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mitch. I completely agree with your putting this forward, that actually this is more about shifting public culture towards production, but also towards information sharing and information communication. And as part of this DIWO, which has been partially part of my dissertation research that started from looking at environmental issues, let's say air quality in Los Angeles, water issues in Miami, which was one of the main reasons why I joined FIU. Actually, the tools are the same, and sometimes questions are the same. And some of the questions are, let's say, rising from lack of just initial understanding of, I'm going to use this term, users or citizens. So as let's say, as producers, as designers, as facilitators, because I think right now it's really difficult to think about the term architect. I find myself always just rethinking and reusing some of this terms. So let's say as facilitators, what is really important for us is when we do have access to certain resources, certain skills, certain connections to really think about how our discipline as architecture, as planners, as designers, which allows us to sometimes be able to look at problems in different scales and with different maybe short-term and long-term, let's say, effects, to be able to curate things quite well. And I think this is something that we gain as part of our training. And so some of these efforts has been looking at truly understanding citizens. So from looking at creating groups, whether in person or let's say in more traditional, creating community meetings, truly understanding let's say initial questions that should be asked versus questions that we often assume. And I think this is sometimes the problem maybe which we've had in the past 20 years. We really did not have much to respond to, right? We were bombarded with new tools and techniques and conferences to attend, certain things to, let's say, certain academic maybe tiers to affiliate ourselves, and we truly haven't had the opportunity to reflect on things. And so all of those efforts and through the previous grant, which was all about looking at network production and then kind of understanding that we cannot really look at one issue. These issues are multidimensional, they're interconnected, and you as a researcher, however large your network might be, it's still very difficult to research and focus. So it's been really important to think about always working in networks, and part of that has been also platform development. Now, there are limitations with platform developments in terms of technology, in terms of, again, certain assumptions that you might be making. But I think going back to the open source model, this is definitely more than ever important, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of concepts that are driving our understanding of even information exchange and communication. So with our efforts, it's been actually quite sobering to understand that a lot of our initial assumptions that we made when we were looking at other efforts being done were perhaps quite generic, because it happened so fast. We didn't have time to reflect properly. We spoke with healthcare providers, and again, depending on who you talk to, the needs were different, the efforts were different. And I completely agree that after this current kind of the immediate alarm that we all responded to, now it seems like we're going to be living with this for a very, very long time. So what does that mean to our education, to the production, our relationship to the society, and then society's relationship to us? So I think more than ever, our response has been just understanding that we cannot really design something that's finite. So we really have to think about flexible systems, flexible, let's say, components that are distributing to projects in whichever scale that might be. So I think, again, it's also very difficult to think about this research without acknowledging the kind of the leverage that we in academia have for even being in this opportunity to speak about this. So how do we go beyond this? How do we truly understand how we can contribute? So I'm just hoping that this type of conversations continue, because we're in this for a long run and our discipline is never going to be the same. Thank you.
Can I possibly add something to that, Jenny?
Yeah, please.
Because I really like that point, but I think since we're all in a kind of university, we have university affiliations, and we talk about that. I think we have to talk about the strength and the weaknesses that the university affiliation provides. You know, when we were working with the Sweet Home Baptist Missionary Baptist Church, to provide PPE to Black-owned barbershops and beauty parlors, it was the first time probably that we had ever had that connection, and there was a lot of trust that needed to be built between kind of what we were providing, what they needed, who was asking, who was talking, and I think universities they're almost built around the laboratory model, which I think we've all noted is something that needs to be questioned, and we are uniquely positioned to challenge it and redistribute it. But who it gets redistributed to is such an important question. And I love that I think Alvin brought up the 750 million people who have 3D printers around the world. And I just wonder who they are, who those people are. And are they people of a certain class? Are they people of a certain education? And how do we, if anything that we've learned from this pandemic, we have to kind of ask ourselves, how do we kind of de-escalate the optic of privilege? It might not even just be an optic, the privilege itself of having a 3D printer, and think about this redistribution in a way that's more economical and kind of addresses economic factors. And I just want to say one other thing that we've noticed here is that that our production has kind of become a work program in the New Deal kind of sense for the university. We've actually adopted other faculty and staff members from other parts of the university who are not at the moment, at least, dealing with students directly, and offered them a way during the summer to work. So this idea of work and who works and how we work, I think, is all really up for this, up for negotiation and questioning.
Thank you, John. Really important points. I think also related to that, in terms of the institution, I think we've all, in the context of this specific work around PPE and launching very quickly initiatives across disciplines, we've had sort of varied responses at the institutional level, from kind of roadblocks because of issues around liability to institutions that, institutional response that you described, John, is, from the president on down, massive support. And I think back 15 plus years ago when I started collaborating with biologists and material scientists, and, there were a lot of people, including dear colleagues, that were like, the heck are you doing? What a waste of time. And I very fortunately had a chair at the time and the dean of medicine, this was when I was at Penn, who were like, this is super important. This is the future. Collaboration is where it's at. And they helped to, bolster me when I was feeling, a lack of confidence, but also they provided a structure and a space to both do the research and to also teach and to really forge ahead with establishing a new model to replace an existing one, which is still in formation. But that institutional support is so key. And I know Mitch, our two deans aligned and they were like, yeah, let's see what you guys can do. And so I'm curious to hear more from you as to how you've navigated that. And, has it inspired new structures or opened the minds of those that are in leadership to maybe rethink things that in turn address some of the issues of inequality and areas that, you know, really need to be opened up, John, that, you know, you've just talked about.
I would just add two things. One of the things that you kind of understand where and how people are educated when in the university, when you start to deal with them on an urgent issue like PPE. So the president of political science, gung-ho, let's do it. Let's get this out. We want to be the model for all of Latin America. We want this, you know, open source. Our legal counsel, they were like, you got to be kidding. You're going to actually put this out and it has not been approved by the FDA and it has not been, you know, and somebody's going to put the shield on, they're going to trip and fall over a chair that's in front of them. It's going to be our liability. So, and lawyers are kind of trained to do that. And on the other hand, too, the head of the hospital. So we were dealing with the CEO of the hospital, who was also like, what comes in my hospital is up to me. And I need to test it and thoroughly test it and vet it. And you realize then the different mindsets for how organizations kind of create walls or create structure that enables them to succeed in ways that they've traditionally been able to, but also how those walls need to be challenged and changed if like the model you mentioned, Jenny, which is you've just done such amazing work throughout your entire career, that that really has to be the future. But we're always pushing up against, I think, people who are looking at the liability, looking at what's coming into the hospital, what is PPE for us. I even heard of examples where hospitals were not allowing PPE in that was acquired privately. For example, it had to be official from the hospital. So in so many ways, the architect that I think that Biayna was talking about, the new architect. We're trained in thinking of systems, and we think about complex systems all the time. And we have to help others now think systemically about their challenges in the world and how we may not be able to solve all of their problems, but we have to at least be able to show that the way in which they can maybe think through some of these challenges to make it a more equitable world.
Yeah, if I can contribute to that point, Jenny, is that all right?
Yeah, please.
So yeah, I think that's an incredibly interesting topic. Like I think now we are also starting to situate kind of the politics of automation and distribution and networking, right? Is something that we've been kind of discussing for long, but has never been a priority to formulate, right? And this event has forced us to take very, very quick decisions and evaluate an entire set of different circumstances. And it has led to very different responses, right? Like in my experience, being both in Spain and the UK, obviously the issue of regulations for the PPE kind of came in very early, right? And kind of the country generally just reacted in a very Spanish way, saying, "Well, look, I really don't care. It's better than nothing." That was not coming only from users, it was coming from hospitals, right? To the point that most local governments started to issue urgent regulation measures to approve 3D printed PPE, right? And that kind of led to an entire discussion. Those regulations were coming back and forth. For example, Madrid, that was very early. I'm very, very badly affected by this issue that at the beginning, and 2 days later they retracted that, right? Because there is obviously all sorts of pressures coming from governmental levels, coming from private companies, coming from suppliers, right, that they had. I heard also that there were some legal problems with 3D printed ventilators regarding the patent of the company that manufactures them, right? That were not really happy with them to be 3D printed, but those actually saved lives on the spot, and we didn't have time to go through the common and normal regulation procedure, and it still did work, right? And the hospitals just basically raised their hand and said, look, It doesn't matter. It goes, as you were mentioning before, just deliver it to my door and I will know how to deal with it. The UK had a completely different response, right? And we saw a huge projection on the parliament with hospitals from all over the country asking and requesting PPE urgently. And the government basically didn't facilitate these measures. And I mean, I'm not sure of how much of that is affecting the numbers, but I think it is something that at least needs to be evaluated. And not only for now, but I think there are issues with legislation related to new technologies, new modes of thinking that require probably a reformulation that we haven't yet done. In another domain, which is incredibly socially important, which is the housing crisis, that is again not going off after the viruses. We've seen how there is a decrease in the efficiency in production of housing. I'm talking about the UK. I don't really know numbers for others, but so we produce less housing than 10 years ago, and the demand is 4 times higher. And obviously, there's some technological advantages, but advances that we can take forward much more powerfully. But at the same time, I think regulations are sometimes stopping that development, and you know, things need to be regulated, but we sometimes need a more global discussion about how.
I think we lost you the last 10 seconds there or so, Manuel.
It's fine. I was closing.
Okay.
I'm just saying that perhaps a topic that we should discuss as well is like the politics of how to deal with these kind of regulations.
Great, thank you, Manuel. We've touched upon aspects of this following question, but maybe I'll restate it so that we can continue to explore some of these important issues. So clearly, we are an international panel. From the politicization of masks in the US to the disproportionate numbers of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, elderly and minority communities affected by COVID-19 to what we have all experienced, the jaw-dropping gaps in supply chains of PPE for our frontline healthcare professionals. I'm curious to hear a bit more from each of you as to how this and these issues have, you know, worked to politicize and radicalize your practice. Who are you collaborating with, or who are you sort of thinking about collaborating with? And, you know, I think it would be great, Mitch, to maybe start with you to hear a little bit more about your new practice that you literally launched, 2 or 3 days ago? So I'll kick it off there.
Okay, sure, thanks. I see if I can do this in a way that kind of circles back to these questions we were just talking about regulations too. So Atelier Office is a practice that I'm merging really an office with a Mina Blackshear's practice to become Atelier Office. And effectively we're both really invested. Oh, I see what happened. Sorry, I've got a toddler situation here. Somebody was trying to be independent, and now I understand what happened. Oh, he was trying to kind of dress himself. Okay, but we're a practice led by 2 Black women, really optimistic about the future in technology, and I think, you know, this relates to what we're going through as far as the discipline in our relationship to this pandemic, because in some ways communities have been in pandemics for a while now. You know, I mean, whether it's the pandemic of homelessness, or whether it's the pandemic of white supremacy, or whether it's, you know, the pandemic of refugee crises. And so I think, you know, being a practice, yeah, I'm going to clean you up soon. Being a practice that's, you know, based in the US, I mean, one of the reasons I felt the need to open up the architecture school and start working on PPE is because I knew it was going to hit Black America hard. The numbers hadn't even come out yet. Yamana Taylor hadn't written the pieces yet, but it was clear to me that it was going to hit Black America hard because everything that happens in this country hits Black America hard. You know, and so, and especially it was, you know, starting, you know, with the East Coast was clearly hit in California. So that to me, it felt like something that I needed to be a part of. And I think I see my work in architecture as consistent. I'm gonna have to kind of sign off soon because I'm realizing the crisis that I'm in my house with the toddler right now. But okay, maybe I'll just kind of leave it there. I think just being Black in this field, being optimistic about technology, the kind of work that we're doing with PPE is the kind of work that I see myself doing over and over again at different scales and in different contexts. All right, I'm gonna have to sign off. Sorry.
Thanks, Mitch.
All right, thank you. All right.
Any of our other panelists like to jump in terms of, you know, new collaborations that you're starting to form? John.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in. I can't really compete with Mitch's statement there, and I completely agree. And one of the things that I'm hoping that will come out of this in terms of practice will be kind of a continued search for equity and for the imagination that she mentioned, this kind of public imagination, so that the idea that that we could kind of build on the relationships that the PPE forced us into kind of establishing by the fact that we were just a kind of a provider of last resort, then to kind of move those things forward, like with children, for example. And I think working with the Children's Hospital in particular is a moment when you can kind of introduce this understanding of empowerment that comes with the idea that you can make something and then you can think of something and you can make it for you as you need it. I think is something that we have to get children to imagine. So when they're students, they imagine. So when they're citizens, they imagine. So when the next generation that grows out of this pandemic has an opportunity to kind of stretch their wings and do what Manuel was talking about doing, kind of like, you know, breaking all the things that we've been trying to do, and moving them, breaking them for good, I think is part of what we can look at. The other thing, it reminds me going back to the late 80s when I was in school, and it was, you know, there was a common trope in architecture schools to kind of give two problems at the same time. One would be kind of a large scale problem and one would be a small scale problem, and that you kind of have to do both of them at the same time. I mean, this was like Columbia with Ando and other people teaching there, and it was kind of like, I'm wondering if we're going to be going back to that, if like this PPE memory, once this whole crisis has stopped, this kind of memory of what we've done can impact housing, because I work a lot with historic preservation, and historic preservation is a lot about, you know, we're working against gentrification, where we're looking for alternative histories, we're looking for ways in which, but we're also looking for the stuff of life, the things, the details around us. And I'm wondering if those things can kind of, those ideas can mesh, so that there's a way in which, though what we've learned that we can and can't do during this pandemic will help us to be better at giving everybody an opportunity to kind of have a richer life in the housing context, or in the context of urban planning, or as we're rethinking spatial distance and kind of where and how we need to be. You know, going back to Alvin's trekking, his hiking question, those things, and I think Biayna and I've talked about how AI can help us kind of figure some of those things out, can help us to understand the complexity of the situation and know exactly, look at crowd sensing. So some of the projects I'm working on now is a new NSF rant on crowd sensing and crowd sensing technology and working with landscape architects and urban planners to engage the technology, even going back to campus, kind of working with the campus to enhance the crowd sensing technologies on campus and how we use that data. So all of these things, they're all intertwined in a very in complex ways, but I think that maybe to the non-architect would seem unrelated, but I think, as Manuel pointed out, they really are related.
Completely. Biayna,
yeah, if I may, just I want to give a plug. You guys, Jenny, Alvin, and Mitch, you did a podcast I think almost 2 months ago with Midnight Charade, and there, Alvin, you were talking about actually affording social distancing and problem of housing. So I thought that was a very important point to bring up. And if we don't have, we're running out of time, but I encourage everybody to go back and check out those conversations, because it's very interesting to kind of hear your reflections maybe a few months after the crisis, and then now looking back, since we're definitely not midway. We're still trying to figure it out, but I agree that that's quite important. But I would say, in my sense, I'm Armenian, but I was born in Iran, so I have family in both places, and it's been quite interesting to see, for instance, how in Iran information data was not reported properly, and then in Armenia, the traditions and even the way that let's say social spaces are constructed, it actually didn't help them in suppressing the pandemics. So it's quite. I completely agree with you, John. It's going to be this this reference that forever is going to affect the way we're thinking about information, also the way that we're thinking socio-spatial dynamics, and this is quite important, thinking about physical spaces, but as much as virtual spaces that we're constantly occupying and will be designing in combination. So yeah, so for me, and I'm in the middle of writing my dissertation, and it is very much of it is about basically information diplomacy, and it's been really overwhelming, but I would say exciting to see some of the advancements and pushbacks and policies that are starting to, maybe we're starting to see hints of these policies that have been very much important in terms of privacy, but also transparency. So I'm in general hopeful. Hopefully we'll walk away from all of this as better designers, as better thinkers. Let's see.
Thank you, Biayna. So I think I'll transition to my last question. We're quickly coming up on the hour, which relates to many of the points that were just raised. I'm curious to hear more from each of you as to how this work in the space has impacted your pedagogical models. Curious to hear about what you're thinking about teaching in the fall. Here at Cornell, just yesterday, and as was announced by our president, we will be reactivating our campus in the fall. So, you know, we've, like I'm sure all of you, been looking at all kinds of different scenarios, hybrid forms of teaching, you know, in the context of what we do as academics, as educators, we're engaged in active learning, right? And that space is teaching studio is oftentimes very difficult to imagine being online. So I think that opens up all kinds of new questions and potential shifts in how we teach, and of course also considering social distancing and the metric that then brings to the studio context. So I'd love to hear from you. What will you be teaching in the fall? How are you rethinking the way that you engage with your students as educators?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Like, I think relative to the current situation, because I think we're all strategized, at least on my end. You know, I have to say, it's been an unusual time to inherit the reins as the director of a program, like just in time for a global pandemic, economic meltdown, and societal collapse. You know, as the way to kind of welcome me into this position. But I think right now I'm spending most of my time actually not thinking about what I'm teaching, but how anybody's going to teach, and what that means as a whole. And I think the content is something that I haven't even gotten a chance to think about. Really, it's more about like the protocols and procedures, and you know, thinking about the fact that we've proven, at least in the last 4 months, that, you know, it's possible to teach architecture online, and that, you know, the results can actually be quite good. And in some cases, I think the results were better. You know, like that we had like these, like, let's say, amazing conversations and discussions, both as desk crits, but also as reviews. I felt like reviews were so much better online, you know, in terms of student interaction and the dialogue and discussion. But then I also know that a lot of that came about because, or at least my presumption is that a lot of that came about because we had half a semester in person to establish relationships and develop a rapport that could be extended into the virtual. Whereas, you know, let's say it's easier to have a long distance relationship that, you know, was started off as a romance in person and then became long distance. I think it's probably quite hard to start a long distance relationship from long distance. You know, and I think right now what we're looking at in terms of thinking about with USC is there's a huge split, right? Like in terms of, we've got half our students who are saying, you know, if it's going to be virtual, I'm not going to come back because I don't want to pay that tuition for virtual. And then we got another half who's saying, if it's going to be in person, I'm not coming back because I don't want to risk my life, or I don't want to risk the lives of, you know, the people I live with or that I'm connected to. And so we're trying to figure out how to, you know, create the environment that we can continue to provide the best education that we can provide and extend the culture of the school into a virtual space. And I think one of the things that I'm doing, so what I am teaching is, as a director, I'm teaching one of our, what historically was our pre-term graduate architecture boot camp, which is something that would happen before the term started. And now we're shifting from pre-term because there's no way our international students will make it in time for something that happens before the term. They may not even make it in time or at all for the regular term with the visa situations and US embassies, and the fact that if I were international, I don't know why anybody would come to this country right now. But like, we're now shifting it to be in parallel during the term, but rather than be a pre-term boot camp, we're shifting it to be a discussion course, a kind of container for studio culture, right? So it actually is less about the work as studio is, where you're doing the work, or less about history theory where you're being lectured to and talked about the work, but becomes a kind of container for conversations that we can have a space just to talk about what they're doing in studio and what they're doing in sorry, my daughter's asking me a question on the side here. Like, yes, that's a pan. She's doing a cooking class and she's coming over to me, and and that is a pan. Sorry, I got distracted there. But basically, I think for us, that's the biggest issue, is like in the split between virtual and physical, where we're now looking at a kind of hybrid situation where studios will be physical, but only 1 day a week physical, and then the rest will be virtual, and fabrication courses will still be physical. What that hybrid situation looks like, but what is more importantly, I think, that loss of culture mean, right? Like, because the engagement of the students only happens, let's say, at a fraction in class time. Most of the engagement is happening outside of class and in other venues. And so we're trying to create a class now that is a container for that culture.
Right.
If I may, I had the pleasure of teaching digital boot camps at USC a couple of years. So one of the things that was essential was actually the proximity that allows you to absolutely kind of get over your shyness, ask all the questions before it gets tough. So I just reflecting on Digital Futures workshop, which because Digital Futures workshop happened after we were all done teaching half a semester in person and half a semester remotely. It's been really fascinating looking at how about 80 workshops. So these are mainly educators they had a really good half a semester on Zoom. They're familiar with the platform, but they had the luxury of that first semester in their labs, etc. So it's been really interesting to look at all the creative combinations that instructors have come up with, from multiple cameras on robots, on let's say on the 3D printers, to we have a workshop in Greece currently. They have a few local students that are doing the production with the proper distance in the lab, while the rest of the class is globally distributed. And it's been quite exciting. But one of the challenges that I faced a couple of days ago with our first session was actually group formation. It took incredibly long, a process that's usually first day of class, you're sitting with a group, you know them, you've already got a coffee with them. It became kind of this incredibly long process of actually creating a matrix of everybody's interests and ability. So it was quite fascinating how that component was quite challenging. And I see this going forward for the courses that we're going to be teaching, unless we come up with a better way of either, as you mentioned, it seems like a lot of schools are looking at a combination method, but let's say our school, FIU, it has a very, very large population. So it's almost kind of, you don't have the luxury of small studios, small courses. So some courses are, let's say 100 studio seminars. So how do you kind of, maybe navigate those type of classes for studio, which is quite small. But for me, a few days ago, that was the first hint of, this is going to be challenging going forward, because these are things that we haven't thought about, because certain things are already preset. Thank you.
And I think that also touches upon what you were just talking about, Alvin, in terms of studio culture. I mean, I always tell my students, yes, you'll learn from me, but you're going to learn so much more from your own colleagues. The learning doesn't just happen in the 4 hours 3 times a week that we're in studio, but it happens in the late hours, the kind of moments of sort of sparks, and how do you put that online? I don't think you necessarily can, but I was going to mention Digital Futures. It's been incredible, Biayna, to see so many people come together very, very quickly, including this panel in the last week, to put all of these workshops online, to donate time and effort for free, to open it up internationally. I have students participating in some of the workshops, and I think it's been just really inspiring to see how that can be done, from a sort of bottom-up perspective, to innovating more formal kind of structures for how you can do it well in an online format. And so I'm excited to see where that continues to kind of thrive and push people in their home academic institutions.
But also using opportunities like this, and we're really looking forward to the feedback that we'll be getting from the instructors and from the panels to really rethink this, because we are just anticipating, and we're trying to understand what this means to the courses that we will be designing. Most of us, I don't think we had the luxury of writing the syllabus or rewriting the syllabus. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Is there a moment to say another thing about this, the pedagogy in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. We got about 5 more minutes.
Okay, it just occurs to me that internationally, because we're, this is an international convening, and these forms of convening our kind of default, right? Whether you're at the same institution or another institution or another country. And it strikes me that this moment of this pandemic, because the federal government has been sort of taken over by this kind of anti-democratic fascist wing, it puts us in a position where the United States is no longer a convener, right? We literally cannot fly easily, even into Europe right now. I think that's an opportunity for the world to take a break from this US domination, this English speaking domination that has been so prevalent, you know, not just in architecture, right? I mean, from international finance to, you know, economic development, right? I think it's a real opportunity for the world to take a break from, you know, American domination for a moment. And I hope that's part of, and it seems that you're, you know, you already get that. I hope that that is something that spreads, you know, without us in the US even being tapped in to what it is that, you know, is happening in the realm of technology and digital futures even. How wonderful would that be? You know, the kind of digital futures that didn't even involve the US for a couple of years.
Thanks.
Can I just add to that? I think
Yeah.
that there are many people who aren't from the United States among us, and I'm hoping when we're talking about pedagogy in the fall to be able to, even if I can't bring the students together, to bring a lot more voices into the studio. I'm going to be able to ask everybody, if we're working on a block or a part of the city, I'm going to be able to ask everybody who lives in that part of the city to participate in these conversations with students. And I think getting that, understanding how to navigate in a world in which there are multiple voices, more voices than just the dominant US trained voice, kind of is kind of the most important, from my perspective, the most important part of studio, which is not listening to architects and trying to learn the language, but listening to others and learning kind of how to understand any and as many languages as possible. So I would say I'm really looking forward to having confusing conversations about challenging topics and seeing if architecture can finally break. I think the studio in some ways is also kind of a prison, and I would like to see it kind of evolve into a city.
I would agree with that as well. I really think maybe because I'm an extremely positive person, sometimes too much, but I do see this regardless of how hard it is to establish these physical connections, and especially the drinks after crits and these kind of events. I actually see this as a great opportunity to start reformulating education more globally. I mean, I've been in so many events that I wouldn't have otherwise in the last 2 months. And, from the States to Graz to Germany right? It's incredible. Like we have crits next week and we're like half of the panelists from the US, for example. And we have people from all over the world that we wouldn't have access otherwise. And you start seeing initiatives that really rethink the educational model completely out of necessity. The other day, I was with one of my colleagues in a crit where they were doing a collaborative project. So out of necessity, they had to create an application to work collaboratively, like putting pieces together in an AR format. And then they distributely manufacture all the pieces. They met in groups every day, a few of them, and assemble it together into a structure. Like, I think the way we rethink how to access information, how to share information and knowledge and have discussions. But also beyond that, we start to kind of tackle different new initiatives for how we can more, let's say, or how can we increase our capacity for making, not being completely locked by this workshop and a studio in a fixed place. And I think it's really opening our minds so much. And I'm very thrilled to see what will happen in the few months after this, because I think the combination will be very, very positive for our development as designers, as architects, and certainly as academics.
Thank you, Manuel. We are just almost right at time. I want to thank all of you, Biayna, John, Mitch, Alvin, Manuel, for taking precious time away from your busy schedules. This has just been really fantastic. And thanks to Digital Futures and everyone involved. And I know for myself, I really look forward to continuing this exchange and, you know, unearthing new models for teaching and research and working together as a team, as an international team. So thanks again, and I look forward to staying in touch. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.